In October of 2017, a tandem axle haul truck from the Allegheny Steel Corporation backed down a gravel road in Mercer County, Pennsylvania, and for the first time in 12 years, it did not dump anything. It was there to take something away. Nora Vance stood at the door of her forge and watched it come. She was 80 years old that autumn, small and straight in her leather apron, her hands at her sides. And she watched the truck back down the lane, the way she had watched everything in her life, without hurry, without expression, with the full and patient attention of a woman who had learned that most things revealed themselves completely if you gave them enough time. The loader was already running. The black particulate was already being scooped into industrial sacks. The ridge that had grown along her fence line for 12 years was finally moving, and it was moving in the right direction. She stood there until the first sack was filled and tied. Then she went back inside and picked up her hammer. To understand what she was watching, you have to go back to the land itself. You have to go back further than Nora, further than her father, all the way back to 1888, when a man named Thomas Vance stepped off a train in western Pennsylvania with a deed in his coat pocket and $3 left to his name. The deed was for 3.2 acres of bottom ground in Mercer County land, wedged between the Shenango River and the edge of what would become, 13 years later, the Allegheny Steel Complex. He had paid $8 an acre. He had thought he was buying land. He had actually been buying time, a century and a quarter of it, enough time for what the land contained to find the person capable of understanding it. Thomas built a forge on that land in 1891. Not a building so much as a collection of intentions held together by a tin roof and oak beams salvaged from a barn that had already given up. The floor was packed earth dark and dense, and it smelled of coal smoke and hot iron, and something older than either of those things. Something like the particular patience of work done well over a long time. In the center of the room, he placed an anvil. It was a 300-pound hay button, forged in Brooklyn in 1895. And he had bought it with 3 years of careful saving and hauled it west by rail and then by wagon. And the day he set it down on the packed earth floor and heard the ring of it clean and true, he wrote a single line in the journal he kept. He wrote, "This is the right place for this." That journal was still in the forge the morning the truck came back. It sat in a wooden chest that Thomas had built, a chest with felt-lined cutouts for each tool, and it had passed from Thomas to his son, and from his son to his daughter, and the daughter was Nora, and she had read every word of it before she was 12 years old. She had grown up in that forge, the way children grow up in kitchens, absorbing the warmth and the smell, and the particular knowledge that lives in the body rather than the mind. Her father Samuel had been a quiet man, spare with words the way skilled people often are, and he had taught her not by explaining, but by standing beside her and waiting until she saw what he was already seeing. He died in 1962, when Nora was 25, too soon before she had learned everything he knew, and she had spent the years immediately after his death making the kinds of mistakes that come from knowing enough to be dangerous, but not enough to be certain. Walt Briggs had arrived unannounced at her forge one morning in the spring of 1965. He was 40 years old, heavy-set, with the kind of hands that only come from decades of work. And he had been a blacksmith in the county since before Nora was born. He had also spent 20 years working at the Allegheny Steel Complex before leaving to open his own forge. And he carried the knowledge of both worlds in him, the way a river carries both its own water and the water of every tributary that has fed it. He had heard in town that the Vance girl was breaking things at her father's forge, and he had driven out to see for himself. He stood in the doorway and watched her work for 15 minutes without speaking. She was forging a set of gate hinges, and she was doing it with the focused intensity of someone trying to compensate through effort for what she had not yet learned through time. He watched the color of the metal. He watched the angle of her hammer. He watched the way she moved around the anvil. Then he pointed at the piece she was working. He said, "Your heat is 30 degrees too high. It will be brittle." She looked at him. She looked at the metal. She adjusted the temperature of the fire. That was the beginning of a friendship that lasted until Walt died in the spring of 2015. He never moved into the forge. He never became her partner or her employee or anything with a name. He simply came by 2 or 3 times a week for 50 years, and they worked in the comfortable silence of people who understand each other without needing to explain themselves. He taught her the things her father had not had time to teach her. He taught her to read the rebound of the hammer against the steel, the way the sound told you about the internal structure of the metal, what was sound and what was not. He taught her to be patient with iron, the way a farmer is patient with ground, understanding that the work and the material were in a conversation, and that the craftsman's job was to listen more than to speak. What Walt did not tell her, not for a long time, was what he had seen at the steel complex during his 20 years there. The first truck from Allegheny Steel arrived on a morning in April of 2005. Nora was 68 years old. She was in the forge quenching a set of barrel hinges when she heard the hydraulic hiss and the metallic clang of a tailgate opening, and she walked out to see. The truck was a Mack painted the functional gray of the Allegheny fleet, and it had backed down to the fence line that separated her 3.2 acres from the mill's vast property. The fence was 4 strands of barbed wire rusted, but intact, and it had marked the boundary between the Vance land and the mill for 100 years without being seriously tested. The material that poured from the truck was black and granular, a dark cascade of fine particulate that built itself into a low mound on the 10-foot utility easement the mill had retained rights to since the original deed. Not on her land, not exactly, but close enough to smell. The driver gave her a cursory wave through the window and drove off. Nora stood at her fence post and looked at the pile for a long time. Then she went back inside the forge and finished the barrel hinges. That night, after the light was gone, she took a flashlight and walked to the fence line. She crouched down and scooped a small handful of the black material from the edge of the pile and held it in the beam of the flashlight, turning her hand slowly, watching the way the particles caught the light. There was something in the texture of it, something in the fineness of the grain that made her stay crouched there longer than made obvious sense. She stood up, put the sample in the pocket of her work pants, and walked back to the house. She did not call a lawyer. She did not call the county. She went to bed thinking about what she had held in her hand. A week later, another truck came, then another the week after that. The pile grew. By the end of the first year, it was 8 feet high along the fence line, a dark ridge that changed the character of the light on the east side of her property in the early morning. She watched it the way she watched everything, with the full attention she had learned from her father, noting how it settled after rain, how frost clung to its peaks in winter, how the surface crusted over in dry periods and stayed soft and granular underneath. In the second year of the accumulation, her neighbor Cliff Darden came over. He was a decent man, a grain farmer, and he was worried in the practical way of a man who could see a problem and knew what problems cost. He brought a piece of paper with the name and phone number of an environmental law firm in Pittsburgh. He set it on the table in Nora's kitchen, the way a man sets down something he has carried a distance. She looked at the paper. She looked at him. She said, "Thank you, Cliff." She did not call the number, but she kept the paper, and she put it in the kitchen drawer where she kept things that required consideration. In 2007, she took a bucket and a shovel to the pile dug into its side to reach the denser, more compressed material below the surface crust and filled the bucket with 45 pounds of black particulate. She drove to the county extension office and paid $60 to have the material analyzed at the State University laboratory. The results came back 3 weeks later in a manila envelope, and she read them at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold beside her. 87% high-grade carbon, mostly graphite and amorphous carbon. The remaining 13% was iron oxide silicon manganese and trace elements the minerals burned out of iron ore in the process of turning it into steel. She read the report twice. Then she drove to Walt Briggs's place. He was in his forge when she arrived, working on a set of plow blades for a farm 2 counties over. She set the lab report on his workbench and waited while he read it. He was 72 years old that year, slower than he had been, but his hands were still precise and his eyes were still sharp, and he read the report with the focused attention he brought to everything. He did not look up immediately. He poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot he kept on the small iron stove in the corner of his forge, and he set one in front of her, and then he sat down on his work stool and looked at the numbers on the page. She said, "You knew." He said, "Yes." She said, "From when?" He said, "From the first year I worked there." They were throwing away the best part of the process. The carbon they burned out of the iron to refine it to steel. They had nowhere to put it, so they stored it, and eventually they found places to dump it. I always thought it was waste in the wrong sense of the word. She said, "Why didn't you tell me?" He said, "Because you hadn't asked the right question yet." He got up and went to a cabinet at the back of his forge. A cabinet she had never seen him open before, and he came back with a composition notebook, the kind with the black and white marbled cover, and he set it in front of her. The cover was stained with oil and the pages were warped at the edges. She opened it. The handwriting inside was his dense and careful dated entries going back to 1978. He said, "I tried it. 27 years ago, I tried to use carbon from the mill in my steel. I failed. My crucible couldn't reach the temperature I needed, and I didn't have a consistent enough base material to work with. I wrote down everything I did wrong." She looked at the pages. Dates, temperatures, observations, notations of failure. The accumulated record of a serious attempt by a serious man. He said, "You have a better crucible than I had. And you have something I did not have by that point." She said, "What?" He said, "Time." She drove home with the lab report and the composition notebook both, and she put them in the wooden chest in the forge beneath her father's journal and beside the 12 hammers in their felt-lined cutouts, and she thought about what Walt had said about time. In 2010, the trucks began coming more frequently. The Allegheny complex was expanding its production capacity, and the volume of byproduct increased accordingly. Where before a truck had come every 4 or 5 days now, they came every 2 or 3. The ridge grew faster, climbing toward 10 feet, and then past it, and the black dust and wind became a more regular presence, settling on the roof of the forge, on the woodpile, on the vegetable garden. She kept on the south side of the house. That year, Cliff Darden came back. This time, he was not alone, and he was not carrying a phone number. He had a petition signed by 5 neighboring property owners addressed to the Mercer County Environmental Office, and he wanted Nora's name at the top of it. He spread it on her kitchen table with the confidence of a man who expects agreement. She read it carefully. It was well written, specific in its citations of county ordinance and EPA guideline, and it named the Allegheny Steel Corporation as the responsible party. It was exactly the kind of document that in the hands of the right lawyer could compel the company to remove everything it had deposited on the easement within a legally enforceable timeline. She pushed it back across the table. Darden stared at her. He said, "Nora, this affects all of us. 5 farms. The dust gets in the grain equipment. My wife has been having respiratory problems since spring." She said, "I am sorry about your wife, Cliff. I mean that." He said, "Then sign the damn petition." She said, "I can't." He left angry, and he stayed angry, and for several years the relationship between the Vance property and the neighboring farms was cool, in the particular way that rural communities manage disagreement, which is to say that people said what was necessary and nothing more. Nora understood the cost of what she was not signing. She paid it without complaint because the arithmetic had already been done, and she knew what the petition would produce, and she knew that what it produced was not what the situation required. Each winter from 2005 forward, she took a small sample from the ridge and put it in a glass jar with a paper label. She wrote the year on each label in her precise handwriting and set the jar on the windowsill of the forge. By 2015, there were 10 jars in a row, each one holding the particular character of the pile. In that year, the compression of it, the grain size, the color. She had watched the material change over the decade as deeper layers were compressed by the weight of what accumulated above them. The material at depth was different from the material on the surface. It was denser, finer, more consistent. It was better. She was learning its nature the way she had learned the nature of every other material she had worked, which was slowly and completely, and with the conviction that material did not give up its secrets to impatience. Walt Briggs died on a Tuesday morning in March of 2015. He died in his sleep, which was the right way for him to go quiet, and without fuss in the house he had lived in for 60 years. He was 90 years old. Nora was 78, and she had known for 2 years that the time was coming, and she had thought she was prepared, and she found that she was not. She was the one who found him, who called the county. The count who sat with him in the hours between his death and the arrival of anyone official. She sat in the chair beside his bed and looked at his hands resting on the blanket. The hands she had watched work iron for 50 years. And she thought about all the things those hands had known that were now simply gone from the world. After the services, after the small gathering at the community hall, after the last car had left his drive, she went alone into his forge. She had been inside it hundreds of times, but it felt different now, emptied of him, the tools on their pegs and the iron stove cold, and the anvil standing in the center of the room, with the particular loneliness of a tool with no one to use it. She did not take his hammers. She did not take his tongs or his punches or any of the things that had been his hands' companions. She took one thing only. She took the composition notebook with the black and white marbled cover, the one with his dated entries and his careful record of failure. She put it inside her apron and walked home in the dark. She put it in the wooden chest with Thomas's journal and the lab report and the 12 hammers in their felt-lined cutouts, and she closed the lid. The forge was quiet around her. The 10 jars on the windowsill caught the last of the evening light. Outside the ridge ran the full length of the fence line, now 14 feet high in places, nearly 200 feet long. 40 tons of material that the Allegheny Steel Corporation had decided was nothing, and that Nora Vance had been deciding for 10 years was something else entirely. She was 78 years old. Her crucible could reach 2,800 degrees. She had Walt's notes on every way the thing could fail. She had 10 years of samples and 10 years of observation. She had the lab report that told her what the material was made of and the composition notebook that told her what had already been tried. What she did not have was time in the way she had once had time. She understood this. Her body had begun to tell her things that she did not always want to hear, and she listened to them with the same attention she brought to everything else because ignoring information was not something she knew how to do. She called her grandson that evening. Owen was 21 years old, a junior at Penn State studying business administration, and he had been asking when he could come home for the summer to help out. She had been putting him off. She said now she had something he could help with. He said, "What is it?" She said it was not what he was going to think it was, and she needed him to wait until he could see it before he decided what it was. He said he would come in June. She said, "Good." She sat for a while at the kitchen table after the call, and she took the kitchen drawer open and looked at the piece of paper Cliff Darden had left in 2005. The phone number of the Pittsburgh law firm, worn from handling its folds, soft from the many times she had taken it out and looked at it and put it back. She had always known it was there. She had taken it out perhaps a dozen times over 10 years. She had never once come close to dialing the number, but she had kept the paper because it was honest to keep it, because there had been moments, especially in the early years, when she had needed to know the alternative was available. She put it back in the drawer. She went to bed and lay in the dark and thought about steel, about what it was and what it could be, about the narrow band between too little and too much, where the useful thing lived. And she thought about Walt's hands resting on the blanket, and about Thomas's line in the journal that she had memorized before she was 12 years old. He had written, "This is the right place for this." She had spent her whole life believing he was right. She still believed it. But believing something and proving it were different activities, and she was 78 years old, and the ridge was 14 feet high and 200 feet long, and she had work to do. Owen Vance arrived on a Friday in June with a duffel bag, a laptop, and a 3-inch binder of printed legal documents that he set on the kitchen table before he had been in the house 20 minutes. He was 22 years old, lean and serious, with the particular energy of a young man who has identified a problem and prepared thoroughly for the meeting in which he intends to solve it. He had driven 4 hours from State College, and he had spent the last 2 of those hours rehearsing what he was going to say. He laid out the documents in the order he had organized them. EPA, Guidelines on Industrial Byproduct Containment. Mercer County Ordinances on Easement. Use case precedents from similar disputes in Ohio and West Virginia, and the lab results he had paid $380 to obtain himself, results that confirmed what was in the pile and that he believed constituted the evidentiary foundation of a strong case. Nora set a glass of iced tea in front of him and sat down across the table. She listened to everything. She let him finish. She did not interrupt, and she did not look away. And when he was done, she reached into the cabinet behind her and brought out the mason jar she had filled in 2007, the one with the faded paper label that said the year in her handwriting, and she set it on the table next to his stack of documents. She unscrewed the lid and pushed it toward him. She said 87% high-grade carbon. I had it tested 9 years ago. Owen looked at the jar. He said, "So it is worse than I thought." She said, "It is not worse. It is different." He looked at her. He said, "It is full of heavy metals." She said, "It is full of ingredients." He stared at the jar and then at her. The word did not connect to anything in the framework he had built over the last 3 months. Ingredients was not a legal category. Ingredients was not a liability classification. He picked up the jar and held it in both hands and looked at the black particulate through the glass and could not find a way to make that word fit the image. He set the jar down. He said, "What are you planning to do with it?" She said, "I am not ready to tell you yet." The summer heat came early that year, and Owen settled into a restless routine in the weeks that followed. He took his laptop to the kitchen table each morning and worked on the legal framework he was building, refining it, adding citations, drafting the letter that he believed would compel the company to act. He was methodical, and he was thorough, and he was convinced with the certainty of a young man who has done his research that he was doing the most useful thing available to him. Nora went to the forge each morning before he was awake and stayed until the light was gone. She had begun clearing out the northeast corner of the forge, the section that had been used for storage since her father's time, boxes of hardware and scrap iron, and things accumulated over decades without a clear purpose. She moved them out, cataloged what was usable, discarded the rest, and began to build. What she was building was a crucible furnace, smaller than her main forge, capable of temperatures her existing equipment could not reach. She had been planning it since 2007. She had the drawings. She had ordered the refractory brick in March. The materials had been sitting in the barn, waiting for the time when she was ready. Owen found her in the middle of it one evening when he came to the forge to tell her about a response he had received from an environmental lawyer in Pittsburgh. He stood in the doorway and looked at the half-constructed furnace and the brick and the tools arranged around it, and did not immediately understand what he was looking at. He said, "What is this?" She said, "A crucible furnace." He said, "What for?" She said, "For the work I am doing." He went back to the house and sent his email to the lawyer. In August, a black Lincoln Town car came down the gravel road. The man who got out was Brett Halloran, senior counsel for the Allegheny Steel Corporation, 40 years old, carrying a briefcase and a rolled plat map, wearing a suit that belonged in a conference room in Pittsburgh, and shoes that were already collecting a film of gravel dust and black particulate as he walked toward the forge. He had the frictionless confidence of a man who has resolved many disputes of this kind and expects to resolve another one this afternoon. He found Nora splitting wood at the side of the forge. She did not stop. He introduced himself, unrolled the plat map on the hood of his car, and walked her through the easement language in the original deed. He was patient and precise, and he used the phrase "legally within our rights" twice, an inert carbon particulate once, an operational byproduct containment once. He told her the company wanted to be a good neighbor. He told her the pile was stable and tested and posed no environmental hazard under EPA guidelines. Then he opened his briefcase and took out a folder. He said the company was prepared to offer a one-time payment of $5,000 for inconvenience and nuisance, along with a commitment to plant a privacy screen of mature arborvitae along the fence line at the company's expense in exchange for a standard nuisance agreement. He slid the folder toward her across the hood of the Lincoln. Then he said there was also a secondary provision he wanted to mention. He said the company was aware that the Vance Forge had been purchasing scrap steel from suppliers in the region, and that the company was prepared as part of a good neighbor arrangement to provide 10 tons of high-grade steel scrap annually for 3 years at no cost. He said this as though it were an afterthought. It was not an afterthought. Someone in the company's legal department had done their research and learned what kind of operation she ran, and had added the provision specifically for her. Nora set down her maul. She picked up the folder and read it. Owen had come around the side of the forge at the sound of the car and was standing 20 feet back, watching. She read the nuisance agreement. She read the secondary provision about the scrap steel. She held the folder for a moment after she finished reading, and the moment was longer than any silence that had come before it in the conversation. Owen saw it from where he was standing. He saw her hold that folder, and he saw the length of the pause, and he filed it away without knowing yet what it meant. She set the folder back on the hood of the Lincoln. She said, "I don't want the money." Halloran's smile tightened in the small, controlled way of a man who is prepared for multiple responses and has reached the one he was least expecting. He said it was a very generous offer. She said, "I don't want the trees either." He said, "Mrs. Vance?" She said, "Leave the pile where it is." He stood there with the unsigned agreement in his hand and looked at her the way a man looks at a situation that has no place in his professional experience. He was an expert in the translation of problems into settlements. He had a framework for every kind of resistance he had encountered in 20 years of corporate law. And that framework did not include a woman who wanted nothing, who was asking him to leave the source of the dispute exactly where it was. He got back in the Lincoln. The gravel crunched under his tires as he reversed up the lane and drove away. The black dust on his shoes went with him. Owen waited until the car was gone. Then he walked to where Nora was standing and said, "You turned down free steel." She said, "Yes." He said, "That was the thing that made you pause." She looked at him. She said, "You saw that." He said, "Yes." She said it was a fair offer for what they thought the problem was. The problem is not what they think it is. He said, "Then tell me what the problem is." She went back inside the forge without answering. Owen's frustration had been building since June, and it reached a point in September where it became action rather than argument. He drove to Mercer one afternoon and met Brett Halloran for coffee at a diner on the main street. He had not told Nora. He sat across from the lawyer and asked directly whether if the Vance family agreed to sign a non-litigation agreement, the company would commit to removing the accumulated material from the easement on a fixed timeline, cleaning it completely and paying the $8,000 Halloran had mentioned as a revised figure in a follow-up letter. Halloran was surprised by the contact, but not displeased. He said he would bring the proposal to the company's operations division and have an answer within 2 weeks. Owen drove home and did not mention the meeting. The answer came in a letter 12 days later. The company would remove all material within 6 months, pay $8,000 and restore the easement to its original condition in exchange for a release of all current and future liability claims signed by Nora Vance as landowner. Owen put the letter on the kitchen table. Nora read it once. The silence in the kitchen lasted longer than the one at the car hood in August. Owen sat across from her and watched her face, which gave him nothing. Then she said, "You went to see him." It was not a question. Owen confirmed it. She stood up and walked to the kitchen door and looked out across the yard to the fence line where the ridge ran black and dense in the September light. Owen followed her to the doorway. He could see the 10 jars on the forge windowsill from where he was standing, the decade of samples in their row. And he looked at them, and looked at the ridge and tried to hold both things in his mind at the same time, and still could not make them connect. She said, "If you sign that they will clear the pile in 6 months. He said, "Yes." "That is the point." She turned and looked at him and said, "I have been watching that pile for 10 years. I have been taking samples of it for 10 years. I have been learning what it is and what it can do for 10 years. If you sign that release, everything I have built toward for a decade disappears in 6 months, and I get $8,000 and a clean fence line." He said, "You are 80 years old." She said, "I know how old I am." He said, "Doc Ferris told me about your heart." She said, "Doc Ferris has been telling people about my heart for 3 years, and I am still here." He said, "You cannot keep working in that forge 12 hours a day at your age. Whatever you are planning with that furnace, whatever you think you are going to do with 40 tons of carbon dust, you have to be realistic about what is physically possible for you." She looked at him the way she looked at things that required patience. She said, "Do not sign anything that has my name on it without my permission. Not now, not for any reason." He said, "I have not signed anything." She said, "I know. But you were going to find out if you could, and now you know you cannot." She went back into the forge and did not come out until after dark. It was 3 weeks later, in mid-October, that she came into the house one morning and found a section of the oak beam above the northwest corner of the forge cracked along its length, a crack that ran 18 inches through wood that had been sound since 1922. Owen was already in the forge when she got there, standing below the beam with a flashlight. He looked at her. He said, "When did this happen?" She said it was already stressed. "The new furnace is heavier than what was there before. The load changed." He said, "This beam has been in this building since before my father was born." She said, "Yes." He said, "You changed the load on it without reinforcing the structure first." She said, "I should have. I was moving faster than I should have been, and I did not think it through." He looked at the crack. He looked at her. He said, "I need you to understand what this beam means. My father used to point to it. He told me my great-grandfather said it himself." She said, "I know." He said, "It is not just a board." She said, "I know that too. And I was wrong to stress it without preparing for it. That is not a thing I can argue about, because it is simply true." The silence between them was different from the silences they had been having all summer. Those had been silences of disagreement. This one was a silence of two people standing in the same place, looking at the same damage, and knowing that the damage was real. Owen had the beam sister reinforced by a carpenter the following week. A man who had done work on old structures in the county for 30 years and who understood how to repair without replacing. The original beam stayed. The crack was stabilized. The forge held. Nora did not ask Owen to help her. He came anyway. He began in November, appearing in the forge in the mornings before she started laying out tools, banking the fire in the crucible furnace, doing the preparation work that freed her hands for the work that required her specific knowledge. He did not ask what she was doing. He watched. He handed her what she needed when she needed it. He learned the rhythm of the work the way he had learned nothing in 3 years of business school, which was through proximity and repetition and the slow accumulation of physical understanding. The failures began in November and continued through December. She was trying to introduce the carbon from the ridge into a base of recycled 1080 steel medium carbon stock she had accumulated from old files and leaf springs and worn farm implements, and the process of getting the carbon content right was a problem that could not be solved by reading or research, only by doing and failing and doing again. The carbon from the ridge was not pure, and it was not consistent. It carried the silicon and the manganese and the trace elements from the steel-making process, and each of those elements interacted with the base steel in ways that changed with temperature and timing and the particular character of each batch of material. She failed 31 times between November and the end of January. Owen saw the 30th failure on a Thursday afternoon in January. He came into the forge and found her standing at the work table, holding a billet of steel that had fractured along a fault line that ran the full length of its body. It had looked right when she drew it from the furnace. It had looked right under the first hammer blows. It had held for 8 folds, and then at the 9th it had opened up along the fault, and that was the end of it. She set the fractured billet down on the table. She sat down on the work stool. She was 79 years old that winter, and she had been standing at the forge since 5 in the morning, and it was now 4 in the afternoon, and her back ached in a way that had recently stopped being temporary and started being permanent. Owen stood in the doorway and did not speak. After a while, she opened the bottom drawer of the work table and took out the paper Cliff Darden had left in 2005. She held it in both hands. She had kept it in the forge drawer since the previous summer, moved from the kitchen because she spent more time in the forge than in the kitchen now. She looked at the number on it, The paper was soft from handling the fold lines white where the ink had worn. Owen could see what she was holding from the doorway. He recognized the size and color of it, because he had seen it in the kitchen drawer his whole childhood. He did not move. She sat with it in her hands for 4 minutes. Owen counted because he had nothing else to do, and because the counting gave him something to focus on besides the possibility he was watching his grandmother give up. Then she folded the paper and put it back in the drawer. She stood up. She went to the rack on the wall where the scrap steel was sorted and began pulling pieces for the 31st attempt. She did not look at Owen. She said, "Go home and eat something." He went. In the last week of March, she made the 32nd attempt, and this time she knew from the first fold that it was different. The carbon had migrated evenly into the base steel. The layers were building without fault. At the 4th fold, the pattern began to appear in the surface of the hot metal, a faint undulation, like water moving over a shallow riverbed, and she had been at the forge long enough and had looked at enough material to know what that meant before she could articulate why she knew. She folded it 10 times, 1,024 layers of base steel and high carbon particulate from the ridge. The carbon content, when she was finished, was in the narrow band, and the silicon and the manganese had done what Walt had written. They would do in the notebook from 1978, the silicon contributing to the hardness, and the manganese, refining the grain structure, and the result was not a standard high-carbon steel, and it was not Damascus in the conventional sense. It was something that did not have a name yet, because it had not existed before this particular material met this particular pair of hands in this particular forge. She forged the blade in 2 days. It was an 8-inch chef's knife, tapered from spine to edge, from heel to tip, the bevel ground at the angle she had been using for 40 years. She spent a day on the grinding and polishing, revealing the pattern in the steel, the watery shimmer of the layers in the finished surface. And then she fit the handle a piece of curly maple she had cut from a tree on the east edge of her property 30 years ago, and kept in her drying rack since waiting for the right blade. The balance was exact. She had made hundreds of knives in her life, and she knew the feel of balance the way a musician knows pitch not as a thought but as a physical fact. And this knife balanced at the point where the blade met the bolster and it felt alive in the hand, in the way that very few objects ever feel alive. She did not show it to Owen immediately. She wrapped it in oilcloth. She carried it across the yard to Walt's forge, the forge that had been locked and cold since March of 2015. She opened the door with the key she had kept on her keyring for 27 months. She went inside. The forge was dim and cold. The tools still on their pegs, the anvil standing in the center of the room. She set the knife on Walt's anvil and stood in the doorway looking at it for a long time. She was not a sentimental woman, and she did not think of herself as performing a ritual. But she wanted him to have seen it before anyone else did, in whatever sense a thing left in the place a person worked could be said to be seen by them. She stood there long enough for the light outside to change. Then she took the knife and carried it back to her own forge. Owen was at the workbench sorting hardware when she came in. She unwrapped the knife and set it down in front of him. He picked it up and held it and did not speak for a full minute, which was unusual for him. He turned it slowly, watching the pattern move in the blade under the forge light, and he looked at the handle and the bolster and the edge, and he tried to say something twice and stopped both times. He said, "What is this?" She nodded toward the fence line. He looked at the knife, and then at the fence line, and then at the knife again. He was starting to understand, but the transformation was too complete. The knife in his hand bore no visible connection to the black ridge beyond the wire. His mind could not yet build the bridge between them. She found the trade journal at the county library the following week, a publication for retail kitchen and cutlery buyers 3 years old, and she looked through the masthead until she found the name of the senior buyer for Williams-Sonoma. The name was Diane Mercer. She wrote the name and the corporate address in San Francisco on the outside of a pine box in her own handwriting, put the knife inside with the oilcloth wrapped around it, put $18 of stamps on the box, and drove it to the post office herself. Owen was in the forge when she left, and in the forge when she came back. She had not told him where she was going. He found out 2 days later when he went looking for the knife and could not find it anywhere. He came to her in the yard. He said, "You mailed it." She said, "Yes." He said, "Without a letter, without a price list, without any way for them to contact you unless they go looking?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Williams-Sonoma receives thousands of packages from vendors and craftspeople every year. Unsolicited packages from unknown senders go directly to receiving and frequently do not get past the first screening. You sent something irreplaceable, the only example of 3 years of work to an address you found in a 3-year-old trade journal with no letter of introduction, no professional context, no follow-up mechanism." She looked at him. She said, "A thing that needs a letter of introduction usually needs a better knife." He stood in the yard and watched her walk back to the forge, and for the first time all summer, he had no answer. Not because she had beaten his argument with a better one, because she had stepped out of the argument entirely, had stepped into a different framework where his reasoning simply did not apply, and he was standing alone in his framework with nothing to push against. The weeks that followed were the hardest kind of waiting, the kind that offers no information and no reassurance and no timeline. Owen checked the email account every morning. He checked it every evening. He told himself the package had been thrown away. He told himself it had never reached the right person. He told himself his grandmother had spent 3 years of her life, and the only proof of it on an act of faith that the world did not reward. And then 6 weeks after the package was mailed, on a Tuesday morning in August, an email arrived. It was from an assistant to Diane Mercer, senior cutlery and kitchenware buyer for Williams-Sonoma. It acknowledged receipt of a hand-forged knife received from the Vance Forge in Mercer County, Pennsylvania. It said that the knife had been examined by the buyer's office and by the company's materials laboratory. It said that Ms. Mercer would very much like to speak with the maker. It asked for a phone number at which she could be reached. Owen read it standing up. He read it 4 times. He printed it, folded it, walked out of the house and across the yard to the forge. Nora was at the crucible furnace. He set the folded paper on the hay-button anvil on the worn and smoothed face of the iron that Thomas Vance had set down in this room in 1895, and he stepped back and waited. She picked it up with hands that were still dark from the work. She read it. She set it back down on the anvil. She nodded once. Then she turned back to the furnace and continued what she was doing, and Owen stood in the doorway of the forge in the summer heat, with the sound of the fire behind him, and the ridge dark and massive beyond the fence, and understood for the first time and completely, and without any reservation at all, that he had not understood any of it. Owen replied to the email that same afternoon with the forge's landline number, and the call came the next morning at 9 o'clock. Nora was already in the forge. Owen went in to get her, and she came to the house still wearing her apron, wiping her hands on a cloth, and picked up the receiver on the 4th ring. The woman on the other end had a direct, unadorned voice. The voice of someone who had spent 20 years making decisions based on evidence rather than presentation, and had lost patience with anything that wasted her time. She identified herself as Diane Mercer and said she had one question before anything else. She said, "Where in God's name do you source your steel?" Nora said, "I make it." There was a pause. Not a long one, but the kind that has weight. Mercer said, "You make it?" Nora said, "Yes." Mercer said she had been a buyer for 22 years. She said she had handled blades from master smiths in Japan, Germany, and France. She said the company's materials laboratory had tested the knife's edge retention and found it 40% higher than their current best-selling German brand. She said the steel had properties she had not seen combined before in a single blade. The hardness of a high-carbon alloy with a flexibility that suggested a layered structure and a surface pattern that appeared to be Damascus, but bore none of the characteristics of conventional Damascus construction. She said she needed to understand what she was looking at. Nora said it is Allegheny steel. Mercer said we have suppliers for Allegheny steel. None of them produce anything like this. Nora said no, they don't. The pause this time was longer, and it had a different quality. Mercer said she would like to send a team to the forge. She said she wanted to see the facility and the process and the source. Nora said she could come the following Thursday. Mercer said she would be there. Owen spent the intervening days in a state of controlled agitation that he managed by making lists. He made a list of what needed to be cleaned, what needed to be organized, what needed to be explained, and in what order. He drafted talking points. He researched Williams-Sonoma's procurement structure and margin expectations and typical contract terms for artisan suppliers. He built essentially a presentation. Nora continued her regular work. On Wednesday evening, Owen came to the forge with his laptop and his notes and asked if they could go over what she was going to say. She looked at him and told him she was going to answer questions. He said there are certain things they will want to know about capacity, about consistency, about the supply chain. If you can't answer those questions clearly, they won't be able to structure a deal even if they want to. She said, then they will ask those questions and I will answer them. He said, I am trying to help you. She said, I know. Make sure the kitchen is clean. 3 people arrived in a black town car at Tian on Thursday morning. Diane Mercer was in her mid-50s, compact and deliberate, with the kind of careful dress that signals seriousness rather than fashion. Beside her was a materials scientist named Dr. Paul Ashworth, who had a PhD from MIT and carried himself with the particular alertness of a man who is always looking for the next interesting thing, and a marketing executive named Carol Britton, who said very little and took very careful notes. They were dressed for San Francisco, and their shoes were impractical on the gravel, and for a moment standing in the yard of a forge that had been operating since 1891. They looked like people who had arrived at the wrong address. Then Mercer looked at the building and looked at Nora, and her expression settled into something focused and attentive, and the awkwardness passed. Nora walked them through the forge. She showed them the hay button anvil and did not tell them how old it was because they would ask, and that was a better sequence. Ashworth asked within 30 seconds. When she told him 1895, he crouched down and looked at the face of it. The worn, smooth surface, the rounded edges, and he put his hand flat on it, the way a man touches something that is older than his understanding of old things. She showed them the 12 hammers in the wooden chest, each in its felt cutout, and she showed them the crucible furnace in the northeast corner, and explained the temperature range and the process in the terse declarative sentences she used for everything. Ashworth asked technical questions, and she answered them. Mercer watched her hands while she talked, the way her hands moved toward tools and surfaces as she described them, the embodied knowledge of a person who had been in physical conversation with her materials for 60 years. When Mercer asked about the 6 knives on the wooden rack, Nora said she had made them after the first one, working out the consistency of the process. Mercer picked each one up in turn. She handled them the way professionals handle things they know how to evaluate, and Owen, watching from the doorway, could see her face change incrementally as she went from the first knife to the sixth. Then Mercer asked the central question. She said, "Mrs. Vance, we are interested in what you have made, but our business requires scale. We would need a minimum of 5,000 units in the first year to justify exclusive retail positioning. To do that, you would need a consistent, reliable source of this specific steel. You told me you make the steel. Can you make enough of it? And what is your source?" Nora set down the hammer she had been holding. She wiped her hands on her apron. She said, "Follow me." She walked them out of the forge across the yard, past the woodpile, past the kitchen garden, to the rusted barbed wire fence at the eastern edge of the property. She stopped at the fence post and pointed. The ridge ran the full length of the fence line, 14 feet high, in places nearly 200 feet long, a dark mass of compressed industrial particulate that had been building since 2005. It was September, and the light was flat, and the ridge was the color of no color, a black that absorbed everything around it. It was the ugliest thing on a piece of land in western Pennsylvania, and it had been treated for 12 years as evidence of corporate indifference, as a public monument to the contempt of large institutions for small ones. The three people from San Francisco stood at the fence and looked at it. Mercer had the original knife in her hand. She looked at the ridge. She looked at the knife. She looked at the ridge again. Ashworth moved first. He crouched at the fence, reached under the lowest wire, and scooped a handful of the black particulate from the base of the ridge. He rubbed it between his fingers, the way Nora had rubbed it in the beam of her flashlight 12 years ago, and his face went through a sequence of expressions that ended at something close to reverence. He said quietly, "The grain size is perfect for infusion. It is almost pure carbon." He looked up at Nora. He said, "Do you know how much is here?" She said, "Just over 40 tons. He stood up. He looked at Mercer. He said, "It is brilliant." Mercer looked from the ridge to the knife in her hand. The distance between those two things, between the most useful object and the most useless seeming, was 12 years of solitary work and 3 years of failure, and a woman who had kept a phone number in a drawer for 10 years as without dialing it. Mercer was a woman who evaluated objects for a living, and she understood in that moment that what she was holding was not a product. It was the end point of something she did not have complete language for yet. She said, "We will take all of it." Owen was standing 20 feet back, watching. He had positioned himself to the side because he understood finally and completely that this was not his scene. He was the witness to it, not the actor. He had driven 4 hours with a binder of legal documents in June, and he had met a corporate lawyer for coffee without telling his grandmother, and he had come within one conversation of destroying the thing she had spent 12 years building, and now he was standing in the yard of a forge that his great-great-grandfather had built and watching a buyer from San Francisco look at a 40-ton pile of industrial waste and say, "We will take all of it." He looked at Nora's back. She was standing at the fence with her hands at her sides, small and straight in her apron, and she was not triumphant, and she was not emotional, and she was not performing anything. She was just present, the way she was always present, with the full and patient attention she brought to everything. He thought about the 31 fractured billets. He thought about the paper in the drawer. He thought about Walt Briggs's hands on the blanket. The contract was signed in September of 2017. It was not a contract for knives because the people at Williams-Sonoma understood that a contract for knives was the wrong shape for what they had found. What they wanted was the story and the source, and the contract they structured reflected that. It gave them exclusive rights to the steel produced from the Allegheny particulate, which they would supply to a production facility operating under the Vance Forge brand name. The term was 5 years, and the total value was $1.2 million. The Allegheny Steel Corporation was not a party to the agreement. Their lawyers, when the situation was eventually described to them in the context of the transport logistics, spent 3 days reviewing the original deed and the easement language and the company's own internal disposal records before concluding that any claim of ownership over material that had been designated as waste and deposited without intent to recover was legally indefensible. They had dumped it. In the language of property law, they had abandoned it. Brett Halloran had to sign the payment authorization for the transport invoice. The invoice was for $1,800, the kind of hiring a tandem axle haul truck and a front-end loader to move 40 tons of material from the easement to a newly constructed storage shed on the Vance property 300 feet away. The holding company that William Sonoma had created for the purpose of the contract received the invoice and routed it to Halloran's desk because his name was still on the original easement correspondence file. He signed it on a Tuesday morning without reading it carefully because it was a small number, and the project name meant nothing to him, and he had larger things on his desk. He had offered $5,000 to make a problem disappear, and now he was paying $1,800 to move that same problem, and the problem had become the foundation of a $1.2 million contract, and he would never know any of this because it was not the kind of information that traveled upward through corporate structures. Owen knew it. He let himself enjoy it for one day and then set it aside because there was work to do. The reporter came in October, the week the truck arrived, to take the first load of material to storage. Her name was Sandra Pruitt, and she wrote for the Mercer County Gazette, and she had heard about the Williams-Sonoma contract through a source at the county recorder's office, where the holding company had registered. She drove out to the forge and knocked on the door. Nora opened it, looked at her press badge, and said, "I don't give interviews." Sandra said, "I have one question." Nora waited. Sandra said, "Why didn't you sue them when you had the chance?" Nora looked at her for a moment. She said, "Because if I had sued them, they would have cleared the pile in 3 months. I needed 12 years. She closed the door. Sandra stood on the step for a minute. Then she sat down on the step and opened her notebook and wrote the quote down and thought about it. Owen came around the side of the forge and found her there. He had heard the exchange through the window. He sat down on the step beside her, which was not something he had planned to do, and she looked at him and did not say anything, because journalists who know their work understand when to be quiet. He said there was a man named Walter Briggs. He was a blacksmith in this county for 60 years. He worked at Allegheny Steel for 20 years before that, and he knew what that pile was made of before my grandmother did. He tried to do what she did in 1978, and he failed because he did not have the right equipment, and he ran out of time. He died 2 years before she got it right. Sandra wrote this down. He said, "Whatever you write about this, his name should be in it. It would not have happened without him." She said, "Was he family?" He said he was better than family. He was someone who showed up. He went back into this forge. Sandra sat on the step and looked at the loader working the ridge in the late afternoon light, scooping the black material into industrial sacks that would go to the storage shed and then to the production facility, and then eventually to a catalog page with a price of $450 and a description about reclaimed high-carbon steel from the heart of the American Rust Belt. She wrote for 2 hours on the step before she drove back to town. The article ran the following week. It was longer than the Gazette usually published, and it led with Nora's single sentence about needing 12 years. And it ended with Walt Briggs's name and the date he died, and the name of his forge and the address of the property where the building still stood, locked and cold with the tools still on their pegs and the anvil in the center of the room. Doc Ferris came by the week after the article ran. He was 73 years old and had been Nora's doctor for 30 years, and her friend for longer than that. And he came without a medical bag and without an appointment, which was how Nora preferred him. He found her at the main forge working on a commission, a set of fireplace tools for a house in Pittsburgh, the kind of regular work she had never stopped doing through all of it. He stood in the doorway and watched her for a while. He said, "I told you to reduce your hours at the forge approximately 300 times in the last 3 years. She said, "Yes." He said, "And you were right every time you did not listen to me." She did not look up from the iron she was working. She said, "You kept me honest, Howard. Knowing what the risk was made me more careful." He nodded. He stood in the doorway for another minute and then went home because there was nothing more to say, and he understood that about people he had known long enough. The first Vance Forge knives appeared in the Williams-Sonoma catalog for the holiday season of 2018. The 8-inch chef's knife was $450. The description said what it was allowed to say, which was the truth, shaped for commerce. And the truth shaped for commerce was still true enough. The first production run of 5,000 units sold out in 3 weeks. A second run was ordered before the catalog cycle closed. Owen did not finish his business degree. He came home instead because there was nothing at Penn State that could teach him what needed to be learned next, and the thing that needed to be learned was in the forge. Nora did not start him at the crucible furnace. She started him at the same place she had started at the main forge with basic stock, learning to read heat and to control the hammer, and to understand that the metal was not a passive material, but something with its own nature that had to be understood before it could be directed. She taught him the way her father had taught her and the way Walt had taught her, after her father, which was by standing beside him and waiting until he saw what she was already seeing. He made many mistakes. She said little about them. She let the work teach him because the work was a better teacher than she was, and she knew it. What she did give him on an evening in November of his first winter home was the wooden chest. She set it on the workbench and opened the lid and showed him what was inside. The 12 hammers in their felt-lined cutouts. Her father's journal. Walt's composition notebook with the black and white marbled cover, the record of 27 failed attempts. The lab report from 2007, the manila envelope worn soft at the corners. And on top of everything, the piece of paper from Cliff Darden's 2005, visit the phone number of the Pittsburgh law firm, soft from handling and white at the fold lines. Owen picked up the Darden paper and looked at it. He said, "You kept this for 20 years. She said 12 years in the kitchen drawer and then 2 years in the forge drawer. He said, "How many times did you take it out?" She said, "Enough times to know what I was choosing not to do." He set the paper back in the chest on top of the lab report, beside the composition notebook. He looked at all of it together. The accumulated record of what the chest held, which was not just tools and documents, but the physical evidence of how knowledge moved between people over time, what got passed on, and what got lost, and what got found again by someone who knew what they were looking for. He said Walt never saw it work. She said no. He said that is not fair. She said a lot of things are not fair. He knew what he was part of. He gave me the notebook. Owen picked up Walt's composition notebook and turned to the first entry. November 1978, the temperature and the result, and the careful notation of what had failed and why. He read several pages. He set it down and picked up Thomas Vance's journal and found the entry about the anvil and read that too. Then he found the last entry Thomas had written, dated 1921, 2 years before he died. He read it once and then again. He set the journal down and looked at his grandmother. He said, "Did you know this was in here?" She said, "I read every word of that journal before I was 12 years old." He read the line again. Thomas Vance had written in 1921, in the steady handwriting of a man who worked with his hands and chose his words carefully, "This land has more in it than I have had time to find. Whoever reads this after me, keep looking." Owen stood at the workbench with the journal in his hands and looked around the forge. The hay-button anvil stood in the center of the room, its face worn and smooth from 122 years of use. The 12 hammers were in their chest. The crucible furnace burned in the northeast corner, and through the forge window he could see the storage shed, where the carbon sat in its industrial sacks, waiting to become steel. The ridge at the fence line was nearly gone, reduced by months of systematic removal to a long, low remnant. And beyond the fence, the Allegheny complex ran its lights against the darkening sky. He thought about the truck that had backed down this lane in October with its first load of black particulate, and the same truck that had come back in 2017 to take it away. He thought about the 12 years between those two events and what had happened in them. He thought about a woman who had watched a problem accumulate for a decade and seen in it not damage but material, not insult but ingredient, not something to be fought but something to be understood. He thought about 31 fractured billets and a piece of paper taken out of a drawer and put back in. He closed Thomas's journal and placed it back in the chest beside Walt's notebook and the lab report and the Darden paper. He lowered the lid. He ran his hand over the wood of it, the surface worn smooth by generations of the same gesture. Nora was at the forge working. She had already turned back to the fireplace commission, her hammer moving in the steady rhythm that had been the background sound of his whole life. Iron on iron, patient and exact. He pulled on his apron. He went to the rack on the wall and selected a piece of stock. Medium carbon, a good starting material for a person who was at the beginning of something. He took it to the fire and watched the color change and waited until the heat was where it needed to be. And then he brought it to the anvil and set it down. The ring of it was clean and true, the way it had been since 1895, the sound of the right tool in the right place, doing the right work. He kept going. Nora Vance died in the winter of 2023, at the age of 86 in the house that Thomas Vance had built on land he had bought in 1888. She died quietly in the way that people die when they have finished what they came to do and have left the right person to carry it forward. She left the forge, the land, the tools, the contracts, and the business to Owen. And she left him one other thing, which was the method she had used for everything, which was to look until you found something, rather than looking to be done with looking. By the time she died, the ridge was gone. It had been consumed entirely by the forge and transformed over 6 years of production into some of the most precisely engineered cutlery available to the American market. Every blade bore the watery pattern of its making the signature of 1,024 layers of base steel and carbon from the Allegheny easement, and every person who bought one held in their hand the end point of a decision made by a woman standing at a fence line in the dark with a flashlight, turning a handful of black dust in her palm, taking it home in her pocket instead of calling a lawyer. Brett Halloran had moved to Chicago before the catalog launched. He never knew the full shape of what he had been part of. He had offered $5,000 to solve a problem that was not a problem, and he had signed a payment authorization for $1,800 to move the solution, and neither number had meant anything to him in the context of his larger work. This was not a failure of character. It was a failure of vision. And it was the kind of failure that no MBA corrects for, and no legal education anticipates the failure to understand that the categories you use to organize the world are not the only categories available. The Mercer County Gazette piece was picked up by a Pittsburgh paper, and then by a national trade publication, and then by several general interest outlets, and each version of the story shortened and simplified it in the ways that such stories get shortened and simplified. And what survived in most versions was the image of the pile and the knife and the woman who had waited 12 years to connect them. Walt Briggs's name survived in some versions and not others. Owen made sure it survived in the ones he had any influence over. In the spring after Nora died, Owen was at the forge early on a Monday morning, working on a billet that would eventually become part of a production run for the following season. The storage shed still held material enough for several more years of production at current rates, and after that, there were conversations to be had about what came next, about whether the formula could be adapted to other sources, about what else the land and the work might have in it. He was not thinking about any of that. He was thinking about the heat of the metal and the angle of the hammer and the way the layers were building in the steel. The same conversation his great-great-grandmother had started with this anvil and this fire 130 years ago. He heard something on the workbench and looked over. The wooden chest was sitting where he had left it the night before the lid down the surface worn smooth. He had moved it to the forge from the house the previous month, because he spent more time in the forge than anywhere else, and he wanted it near him while he was learning. He set down his hammer and went to it. He opened the lid. He looked at the 12 hammers, the journals, the notebook, the lab report, the paper from Cliff Darden's hand. He found the last page of Thomas Vance's journal and read the line again the way he had been reading it since November of 2017. This land has more in it than I have had time to find. Whoever reads this after me, keep looking. He closed the journal and put it back. He went to the rack and selected a new piece of stock, and he brought it to the fire, and he watched the color change in the metal, the way his grandmother had watched it, and her father, before her and the man before him who had stood in this room, and known by some combination of knowledge and instinct and the particular patience of people who work with their hand that a thing does not give up its best quality to impatience. He brought the metal to the hay button and set it down on the face that had been worn smooth by every hand that had preceded his. He picked up the hammer. He kept looking